This presentation is over research questions, hypotheses, and variables completed for the Curriculum and Instruction Doctoral Program at the University of Louisiana at Monroe for the course Applied Statistical Analysis. It is presented by Mackenzie Luters. In this presentation, I will discuss what the research question, hypotheses, and variables are, examples of each, how we use them, and how they all fit and work together as part of a research study. Very quickly, before we get into the research question, it is important to note that the process of developing a research question can only happen after a researcher has identified a problem, topic, or phenomenon to be pursued. To do this, the researcher will first identify the topic to address, investigate, or study, whether descriptively or experimentally. This is most often driven by personal interest, and therefore there is some familiarity with it. A researcher might also choose to identify where the conclusions of previous research are unclear, or where gaps in the research or literature exist. Once the topic for research is narrowed down, it is then time to write a research question. We will begin with research questions. Once a problem of interest is identified, the first step is to develop a research question. Research questions do not entail specific predictions and are phrased in question format. This question is what you will attempt to answer through your experiment or research. And a good research question should specify the population of interest, be of interest to the scientific community and potentially to the public, have relevance, and further the current knowledge in the field. There are three types of research questions: difference, associational, and descriptive. Difference questions compare two or more groups, each group containing individuals with the independent variable. Associational questions relate two or more variables in an attempt to see how those variables co-vary. And descriptive research questions describe or summarize data from research or an experiment. The first type of research question is a difference research question. These questions typically start off with, what is the difference between? An example would be, what is the difference between the daily minutes of exercise in American men and women aged 30 to 34? They are used to show that the independent variables of two or more groups have a different result on the dependent variable. The second type of research question is an associational research question. These questions typically start off with, what is the relationship between? For example, what is the relationship between study time and ACT scores in high school students? Associational research questions are used to show the relationship or the association between variables. The third and final type of research question is a descriptive research question. These questions, in quantitative research, typically start off with something such as, what percentage of, or what proportion of? For example, what percentage of high school students have been suspended from school for more than one day? Descriptive research questions are describing or summarizing data, and they make no attempt to make connections or generalizations to the larger population. When it comes to writing a good research question, many refer to something known as finer criteria. Depending on the researcher or author, what falls under each category is slightly different, but all have the same basic principles, which I will summarize here. F for feasible. It ensures the adequacy of research design, guarantees adequate funding, recruits a target population strategically, aims for an achievable sample size, prioritizes measurable outcomes, and opts for an appropriate and affordable time frame. I, interesting. This attracts the attention of readers and presents a different perspective of the problem. N, novel. Provides different findings, generates new hypotheses, improves methodological flaws of studies that already exist, and it attempts to resolve a gap in existing literature. E for ethical would comply with local ethical committees and safeguard the main principles of ethical research. And finally, R for relevant. This generates new knowledge, stimulates further research, and provides an accurate answer to a specific research question. Next is the hypothesis. The hypothesis is the basis on which the research study is built. It takes the research question and turns it into a predictive statement about the relationship between variables. A good research hypothesis is clear, well-defined, and covers the essential basis of the problem. To have a good hypothesis is to have the important ingredients for the completion of a good study. A hypothesis must be testable, as that is fundamental to proving that its elements are right or wrong. Moreover, the elements within the hypothesis must be testable and able to be compared to one another. There are two types of hypotheses in statistics: null and alternative. A null hypothesis predicts no significant difference between the variables being tested. For example, Samantha hypothesizes that washing her hair with cold water for 30 days will make it grow faster than if she washed it with hot water for the same amount of time. A null hypothesis would be that there is no statistically significant relationship between the temperature of the water and hair growth. An alternative hypothesis demonstrates a significant difference between the variables being tested. In our example with Samantha, an alternative hypothesis would be: if Samantha washes her hair with cold water for 30 days and hot water for 30 days, her hair will grow faster during the cold washing period than during the hot washing period. Now it's time to move on to variables. There are three types of variables that we can use: the independent variable, the dependent variable, and extraneous variables. Independent variables are manipulated or changed in the experiment, and they have an effect on the dependent variable. Dependent variables measure or assess the effect of the independent variable. It is the outcome of the experiment or study. Extraneous variables can influence the dependent variable. However, they are not of interest in the study. We will begin with independent variables, and it's important to note that there are two types: active and attribute. An active independent variable is a variable that is given to a group of participants during the study. Examples could include a workshop provided to teachers, new curriculum implementation, or a new therapy. They can be found in randomized experimental and quasi-experimental studies. An attribute-independent variable is a variable that cannot be manipulated. These include pre-existing attributes of the participants or their environment. Examples of these could include socioeconomic status, gender, age, or ethnicity. Non-experimental studies have only attribute-independent variables. Next are the dependent variables. The dependent variable is thought of as the presumed outcome or criterion. It is dependent upon how the independent factor was manipulated or changed. Examples of dependent variables could include test scores, the number of an object present, or measurements such as height or length as they relate to the manipulation of the independent variable. The last type of variable is extraneous variables, also known as nuisance variables or covariates. Examples could include environmental factors such as temperature or time of day of the study. Simply put, extraneous variables are any variable that is not being specifically manipulated by the researcher, but that could affect the results or outcome of the experiment. The researcher wants to make sure that it is the manipulation of the independent variable that has an effect on the dependent variable. There are four types of extraneous variables. Situational, which is aspects of the environment that might affect the participant's behavior, such as noise or temperature. Participant or person. This is how each participant varies from the other and how this could affect the results. Things like mood, intelligence, and concentration are examples. Experiment effects. These are also known as experimenter bias. The experimenter unconsciously conveys to participants how they should behave. And finally, demand characteristics. These are clues in an experiment which convey to the participant the purpose of the research. Demand characteristics can change the results of an experiment if participants change their behavior to conform to expectations. So how do they all fit together? First, all research studies start by identifying a problem. Once the problem is determined, a researcher develops the research question he or she wishes to base the study around. From there, the hypothesis is developed, stating the predicted outcome. All independent, dependent, and extraneous variables are identified to determine how they will either be used, measured, or controlled in the research study. While a seemingly small part of the overall study itself, establishing a clear question, hypothesis, and how to use and control the variables is the foundation of a successful experiment. If not given proper consideration and forethought, the rest of the study could well be compromised, unsuccessful, or there could be questions of validity and reliability.